The railroad men broke him, until a widow chose what was left of him. The deed was still in my coat pocket when they burned the house. That's the thing nobody ever quite understood. I had the deed, stamped, witnessed, recorded in the county office in Flagstone with a clerk's seal so red it looked like a wound. 62 acres running east from Barrow Creek up to the ridge they called the Spine, water rights included. I'd paid for them in full, I mean every dollar, including the ones I'd borrowed from Amos Creech at the hardware and paid back before the month was out, because I didn't want to owe a man anything, not even the kind of debt you write down in a ledger. I didn't like debts. I liked things settled. The deed was in my pocket, and the house was burning anyway. 3 men. Company men, not marshals, not even the rough kind of hired gun that at least has the decency to look you in the eye. These were company men in clean collars, the kind who carry legal papers the way other men carry revolvers, and they'd come out to Barrow Creek on a Tuesday in late October with a document they said superseded mine. A survey error, they called it. The railroad's track bed had been incorrectly mapped. The corrected survey showed the line running straight through my property, through the eastern 40 acres, through the well, through the barn I'd built with salvaged timber and 2 months of my own hands. I said I wanted to speak to someone. They said there was no one to speak to. I said I'd get a lawyer in Flagstone. They said that was my right, and that in the meantime they'd need to begin clearing operations. Clearing operations. The house was not yet burning when I left for Flagstone. When I came back 2 days later, because the lawyer was a slow man and required a lot of convincing and ultimately told me that the railroad survey, whether honestly done or not, had been accepted by the territorial court. When I came back, the house was a black rectangle on the ground, still smoking at the corners. The barn was gone. The fence posts were gone. They'd even taken the well cap, the stone ring I'd hauled up from the creek bed one at a time over the course of a dry summer 3 years before. I stood there for a while looking at it. I didn't make a sound, that's what I remember. I expected some noise to come out of me, some word or cry. Nothing came. I just stood there in the smell of wet ash and looked at what had been mine and felt something go out inside me the way a lamp goes out when you turn the key all the way down. That was late October. By December I was in a place called Hatcher. Hatcher wasn't much. A water stop mostly, for the line coming up from the south. 12 buildings if you counted the livery, and you had to count the livery or you were down to 11. There was a saloon that served food in the back, a dry goods run by a woman named Burl who weighed about 90 pounds and kept a shotgun under the counter, and a rooming house where I'd taken the back corner room on the 2nd floor. Cheapest they had. No window facing the street, just a slot of glass looking out over the alley and the hill that rose behind it, brown grass gone to frost. I had some money left. Not much. Enough to last through winter if I was careful, and I am always careful. That's one thing the railroad didn't take from me. I'd worked as a surveyor's hand before I'd saved enough to buy the land, and I thought maybe I'd go back to that. But the surveying crews in the territory were mostly railroad crews, and I couldn't do it. Couldn't pick up that chain and walk those lines for men who'd used a line to steal from me. So I stayed in Hatcher and did what work I could find, which wasn't much. Splitting wood, moving freight at the water stop when the trains came through. There was a man named Quill who ran a small freighting operation, mules and 2 wagons, and he'd use me when he needed a second driver. Cold work, slow pay. I ate at the saloon most nights. Beef and beans and bread, sometimes a piece of dried apple pie that was mostly crust. I didn't drink much. I wasn't in the mood, which is the strange thing. I'd have thought a man in my situation would drink, but I found I couldn't be bothered. Drinking requires a kind of wanting, a leaning forward toward the next hour, and I didn't have that. I just had the hours themselves, flat and gray, one after another. I'm trying to tell this the way it actually was, which means I have to tell you that for a while there, 2 months, maybe 3, I was not quite alive. I went through the motions. I ate, I worked, I came back to that room with the alley window and I slept, and in the morning I did it again. I didn't think much about the future. I didn't think much about anything. The anger had burned through fast, the way dry wood burns, bright and hot and then gone, and what was left was ash. Just ash. I wasn't the first man the railroad had done this to. I knew that. It didn't help. She came in on the southbound in early January. I know it was early January because I was at the water stop when the train came through, helping offload a crate of machinery for Quill, and the air had that particular January bite to it. Not the cold that sneaks up on you, but the kind that announces itself, gets right up in your face the moment you step outside. I had my coat buttoned to the throat and my hands in gloves, and I still felt it in my teeth. The train stopped, took on water, and a few people got off. A drummer with his sample case, an old man who was met by someone I didn't know, and then her. She was carrying 2 large bags, one in each hand, and she stood on the platform and looked at the town for a long moment with an expression I recognized, though I couldn't have said why. Not disappointment, exactly. Something more calibrated than that, like she was taking a measurement, like she'd arrived expecting nothing and was now confirming it. She was maybe 40, 42, dark hair going silver at the temples, done up plainly, wore a black coat that had been good once and had weathered since. There was something deliberate about the way she stood there, a stillness that wasn't passivity, the stillness of someone who chooses when to move. I didn't speak to her. I went back to the crate. Her name was Clara Marsh, and she'd come to Hatcher because her husband had homesteaded there the year before and had written her to come when he had things ready. And 2 weeks before she arrived, he'd fallen from a horse and broken something in his skull and died in a camp 3 miles from town without ever getting to tell her himself. I heard this from Burl at the dry goods, who heard everything. She was staying at the rooming house, same rooming house as me. I saw her at meals. The rooming house had a table where Mrs. Aldred set out supper for the boarders. There were 4 of us at the time, me and Clara and a young man from Ohio who was passing through and had stayed longer than he'd planned, and an older fellow named Storch who worked at the livery and didn't talk much. Clara sat across from me and ate neatly and listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was usually a question. About the town, about who ran what, about the homestead claim and what it would take to hold it. She was asking practical questions. She wasn't grieving, or rather she was grieving and doing it privately, the way you do when you can't afford to stop moving. I understood that. The 3rd or 4th night, after the others had gone, she asked me directly what I knew about the land north of town. She'd heard I'd done survey work. I told her what I knew, which was some. The land north of Hatcher ran up against the creek drainage, good grass, water accessible in all but the driest summers. Her husband's claim, from what I gathered, was on the better part of it. She said, "Is the claim sound, legally sound?" Something in me went tight when she said that. I said I didn't know the specifics of her husband's filing, but that I could look at the paperwork if she had it. She looked at me for a moment. "Why would you do that?" I didn't have a good answer. I said, "I know what it's like to lose land." She didn't ask me to explain that. She just nodded slowly and said she'd bring the papers after supper tomorrow. The claim was sound. Her husband had filed it correctly, paid the fees, and done enough improvement work before he died that it met the statutory requirements. I went over it twice. There were no survey errors. There was no overlap with anything the railroad had filed in the territory. I told her that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was a careful man." "Yes," I said, "because the papers showed he was." "I need someone who knows surveying," she said, "to go out there with me and walk the lines. I need to know exactly what I have." I said I wasn't surveying anymore. "I'm not asking you to survey. I'm asking you to walk a line with me and tell me what you see." There's something about a direct person that I've always responded to, even when I didn't want to. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't flattering me. She was just stating a need and asking if I was the right person to fill it. Something about that reached through the ash. I said I'd go. We went out on a clear morning in the second week of January, the ground hard under a thin skin of snow that crackled with each step. She wore a heavy coat and boots that had seen work. I brought the surveyor's tools I still owned. I hadn't sold them, which surprised me when I went looking. I suppose I hadn't been able to bring myself to do it. The compass, the measuring chain, my grandfather's plumb bob that I'd carried since I was 20. The land was good, better than I'd said, even. The south-facing slope held the sun well, and the soil under the snow was dark, the kind of dark that means it holds water without drowning roots. There was a spring-fed draw on the eastern side that her husband had apparently known about. There was a rough marker post beside it, driven into the ground with a piece of tin nailed to the top, and on the tin he'd scratched a small compass rose with an X at the center. Clara stood looking at that tin marker for a long time. I didn't say anything. I measured. By midday I'd walked the 4 lines and marked the corners, and I had a clear picture. 108 acres, with the draw, with the south slope, and a flat bench above the creek that was a natural site for a house. I told her all of this. I drew it on paper, rough but accurate, and showed her where her husband's stake lines ran. She looked at the drawing for a while, then she said, "What would you build first?" I said that wasn't my land. I know that. I'm asking what you'd build first. I looked at the bench above the creek. I thought about it the way I used to think, practically, structurally, weight of materials and direction of prevailing wind, and where the morning light comes from. I hadn't thought that way in months. It felt strange, like using a hand that'd been asleep. Shelter before the spring thaw, I said. Something small and tight. Then the fence lines so you know what's yours. Then a proper well if the spring draw isn't reliable year-round. After that, I stopped. She was looking at me with something I didn't recognize right away because I hadn't seen it in a while. She was listening, not just being polite, actually listening, the way you listen to someone whose judgment you're taking seriously. After that, I said again, and finished the thought. After that, you think about what you're growing and what you need to protect it. She nodded. We walked back to Hatcher without talking much, which was fine. The silence wasn't the heavy kind. It was just silence. I started helping her because she asked, and I had nothing else to do, and that was the truth of it, or part of it. She had a little money, her husband had sent some ahead, and she knew how to make it stretch. She bought lumber in careful quantities, negotiated hard with the man at the mill in Flagstone, and didn't buy anything that wasn't necessary. I appreciated that. Waste had always bothered me. We worked through February. Most days I'd ride out to the claim with her in the morning and we'd work till the light went, then ride back. I did the heavy framing. She did more than most women would and didn't make anything of it. She could drive a nail straight, and she didn't complain when the wind came down off the ridge, and the temperature dropped hard in the afternoons. The young man from Ohio left the rooming house. Storch left too, took a job at a livery in Flagstone. It was just me and Clara and Mrs. Aldred at supper, and then it was often just me and Clara, because Mrs. Aldred was not well that winter and took to eating early in her room. We talked at supper the way 2 people talk when they've spent the day working together, filling in the parts of the day that didn't get spoken. She told me things about where she'd come from, Pennsylvania, a farm town, a family she'd left when she was young and hadn't gone back to. I told her things too, more than I'd expected to. About the land at Barrow Creek. About the deed in my coat pocket that hadn't been worth the clerk's red seal. About the morning I'd stood in the ash smell and couldn't make a sound. She listened to all of that without trying to fix it, which was the right thing to do. There is nothing to fix about it. It happened. One night she said, "What do you want now?" I looked at her across the supper table. Mrs. Aldred's lamp was between us, turned low. I said I didn't know. "I think you do," she said, not unkindly, just directly. I was quiet for a while, then I said, I want land again. I want to build something again. I want to do work that means something at the end of it. Yes, she said, like I'd confirmed something. I didn't ask her what she meant by that. I should have, but I didn't. I just got up and said good night. March came. The walls of her shelter were up and the roof was on, and it wasn't pretty, but it was tight and dry. And on the first warm day when the creek came up with snowmelt, she walked through the door of it and stood in the middle and put her hands on her hips and looked at the ceiling and the walls and the floor packed dirt still, no boards yet, and she said, "My God, it's real." I was outside cutting a notch in a fence post, and I heard her say it through the open door. I knew that feeling, or I'd known it once, the feeling of a thing being real that you'd only imagined before. I kept cutting the notch. She came out and stood beside me, and after a minute she said, "Thank you, Elias." She'd been calling me by my first name for a few weeks by then. I don't remember when that started. I said it wasn't anything. She said, "It's not nothing, don't say it's nothing." There was something in her voice, not anger but something that had some edge to it. I looked up from the post. She was looking at me in a way I hadn't been looked at in a long time, straight on, like she was saying something with the look that she hadn't decided to say in words yet. I went back to the post. The first trouble came in April. 2 men rode out on a morning when I wasn't there. I'd gone into Hatcher for supplies, and they told Clara that the spring draw on the eastern side of her property was being claimed by a rancher named Holt who ran cattle in the area and had used that water for 15 years, and that she'd be better off selling the eastern parcel to him at the price he was offering, which was low, than getting into a dispute with a man who had a long memory and friends in the county office. When I got back in the afternoon, she told me about it without raising her voice. She was mending a fence section as she told me, and she didn't stop working while she talked. I asked what she'd said to them. She said, "I told them to go back and tell Holt that the eastern parcel has a legal deed, and the water draw is on it, and I don't sell under threat." I stood there for a moment. I said, "Those aren't easy words to say to men like that." She looked up from the fence. "No, they're not." She wasn't asking for praise. She was just telling me the truth of how it had gone. I rode into town that afternoon and found the county surveyor, a man I knew from my earlier work, and I asked him what he knew about Holt's water claims. He told me what I expected, that Holt had a use claim, not a deeded claim, and that a use claim yields to a deed. I asked him to put that in writing officially, and he did, though he charged me $3 for the privilege and looked nervous while he signed it. I went to the county recorder too and pulled Holt's filings and Clara's husband's filings and put them side by side, and there was no legitimate conflict. Holt had grazed that land because nobody had owned it. Now someone did. I brought all of it back to Clara the next morning. She read through it carefully, the way she read everything, unhurried, thorough, and then she set it down and looked at me. She said, "You spent your own money on the county surveyor." I said it was $3. "That's not the point." I said the point was that she needed the document. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Why are you still here, Elias?" It was a real question, not accusatory. Genuine, the kind of question a person asks when they already have a thought about the answer but want to hear yours first. I looked at the documents on the table. I looked at the walls I'd helped put up, the window I'd fitted, the latch I'd made from a bent piece of iron because she didn't have the money for a proper one. I said, "Because this is the first thing I've built in 6 months that nobody is going to take away." She was still looking at me. The light through the window was the pale kind you get in early April, cool and even. She said, "I'm not going to take it away." I understood what she meant. I said, "I know." She came around the table and she put her hand on my arm, just above the wrist, and she held it there. Her hand was strong, the fingers weathered, the grip steady. She looked up at me, and there was something in her eyes that I recognized as the thing I'd been afraid to name. She said, "You've been good to me, and I don't think you know how rare that is." I said I'd just done what needed doing. "I know you think that," she said. "I'm telling you it's more than that. Holt sent 3 men in May. Real men this time, not talkers. They came on a Friday morning early, before the light was full, and they cut the east fence line and drove 8 head of cattle through onto Clara's property, deliberate trespass, and then stood by the cut section like they were waiting to see what she'd do. I was there. I'd taken to staying at the claim more nights than not, sleeping in the barn I'd started in March, because I didn't trust the situation and I said so, and Clara hadn't argued. I walked out to the fence line when I heard the cattle. 3 men. One I recognized from the earlier visit. They had rifles on their saddles, but the rifles were still scabbarded, which told me this was meant to be a show, not a fight. They wanted her to call the law and find out she had none on her side, or they wanted her to back down without a fight. Either way, they didn't expect much resistance from a widow on 40 acres. I stood at the cut fence line and looked at the man I recognized. I said, "You're going to want to take those cattle back." He said Holt's cattle had always grazed this land. I said, "And now they don't. Take them back, and bring someone to fix this fence line before you go." He looked at me for a moment, not a long moment. There was something he was reading in my face, I suppose, and whatever he read there made him recalculate. I want to be clear, I wasn't carrying anything beyond a belt knife. I'm not a gun hand. Never was. What I was carrying was the particular steadiness of a man who has already lost everything and therefore doesn't have anything to lose in this conversation, and that reads differently on a man than anger does. Anger can be waited out. Steadiness just sits there. He said, "This ain't settled." I said, "Today it is." They took the cattle out. One of them pulled the cut fence wire back and tied it off badly, but off the ground at least. Clara was standing in the door of the shelter when I walked back. She'd watched the whole thing. She didn't say anything until I got close. Then she said, "You didn't move." I said, "No." She looked at me for a moment, the way she'd looked at me that day in April, and then she stepped aside to let me into the house, and she put a hand briefly on my back as I passed. Just a touch. The kind a person gives when words are too much and not enough at the same time. The summer came in hard and dry, and we worked through it. I say we, and I mean it. There was a period somewhere in June when I stopped thinking of the claim as Clara's and me as a helper on it, and I couldn't tell you exactly when that happened. It happened the way most real things happen, gradually and then all at once, and then you look back and think it must have been coming for a long time. She needed a root cellar. I dug it, reinforced the walls with stone from the creek bed. She needed the south slope broken for a kitchen garden. I broke it and she planted it, and we argued productively about the spacing of the rows, and I was wrong about the squash and she didn't make anything of it. We built a proper well cover for the spring draw, and I showed her how to test the water in dry weather. I repaired the fence line after Holt's men and put it up proper this time. Corner posts set 3 feet down. And somewhere in all of that I started thinking about what the land could support. Not just surviving on it, building something from it. A permanent house, not a shelter. A small herd. Alfalfa on the flat bench if we could manage the irrigation. There it was. I thought about that word for a while one evening, sitting outside with the day cooling down and the hills going blue in the east. I thought about it the way you turn a thing over in your hands when you want to understand the weight of it. I'd had a life before Barrow Creek. I'd had a wife, I should tell you that. Ellen, married 5 years, dead of a fever in our 3rd year on that land. I'd kept going after that the way a man keeps going, because there was work and the work needed doing and nothing else presented itself. I'd loved that land partly because she'd been on it. When they took it, I lost her twice, in a way, which sounds like too much and is exactly right. The thought of wanting something again, of letting myself want it, made me careful, like a man who's had a bad fall and takes the next step gingerly. But I kept using that word, we. It was a night in late July when it came clear between us, or it started to come clear, the way a sky comes clear after a long rain, gradually, and then it's done and you can see everything. We'd been working late, putting up the framing for a proper second room on the shelter. We ate after dark, something thrown together quickly, bread and cold beans and a piece of salt meat, and we sat on the bench outside because the inside was still full of sawdust and the smell of cut wood, which I like but which gets thick. The stars were out, the kind of star field you only get at high altitude in dry air, bright enough that you could see the shape of the hills without the moon. She said, "Tell me what you do with the flat bench." I told her. I'd been thinking about it for weeks. Alfalfa first year to break the soil, then a rotation. I sketched the whole thing out, the water management, the yield, how long before it paid back the investment of breaking the ground. She listened to all of it. When I was done, she was quiet for a minute. Then she said, "You're talking about years." I said I supposed I was. She said, "You're planning years on this land." I looked at the bench in the starlight, the dark shape of it against the sky. I said, "I suppose I am." "Then I need to ask you something," she said. She turned to look at me, and in the starlight her face had the same quality it always had, that particular directness, nothing held back. She said, "Stay, not as a hand, stay." I looked at her. She said, "I've been watching you for 6 months and I know what I see. I see a man who knows what he's doing and why he's doing it and doesn't need to be told he's worth something. I see a man who fixed the fence instead of leaving. I see a man who drove 3 of Holt's men back without raising his voice." She paused. "I see a man I trust," she said, "and I don't trust easily." She wasn't making a speech. She was just being direct, the way she was always direct, and something about the plainness of it, no decoration, no performance, just the thing itself, reached somewhere deep and quiet in me that I'd thought was sealed off. I said, "You know what happened to me. The railroad, my wife." "I know." "A man carrying that much." "Elias," she said simply, and that was enough. The way she said it, my name in her mouth, quiet and steady, said the rest of what she meant. She knew what she was asking and what she was taking on. I looked at the hills. I said, "I don't know how to do this careful." I tried to be careful the first time and lost it anyway. "Nobody's asking you to be careful," she said. "I'm asking you to stay." I stayed. There are people who'll read that and think it's simple, and it is, and it isn't. The night after that conversation, I lay in the barn and stared at the ceiling beams I'd put up in March, and I thought about everything I'd told myself I was done wanting, and I thought about how wrong I'd been, and I thought about the look on her face in the starlight, steady, certain, asking nothing except the one thing she was asking. I was 53 years old. I'd buried a wife. I'd built a life and had it taken, and then I'd lain flat for 3 months like something with all the air knocked out of it. And now here was this woman who'd walked off a train with 2 bags and a dead husband's claim, and some money that wasn't quite enough and a backbone that would have shamed most men I knew, and she'd looked at me, actually looked at me, and she'd said, "I see you and I want you to stay." I thought about that a long time. In the morning I got up before light and I went to the spring draw and I sat there listening to the water for a while. The creek sound, the dark, the first bird starting up somewhere in the willows, the sky going gray to gray-blue to pink at the edges. I walked back to the shelter. The lamp was already lit inside. Clara was up, making coffee on the small stove, and she heard me come in and she looked up and we looked at each other for a moment and nothing needed to be said. I sat down at the table. She set a cup in front of me. I said, "I'm going to need to go to Flagstone." She sat across from me. "Why?" "Because," I said, "if I'm going to be here in 3 years planning that alfalfa rotation, I should file a proper joint claim, so that if anything happens to either of us, the land isn't in dispute. She looked at me for a moment. Her hands were around her cup. The lamp was between us, and the light was the early morning kind, warm yellow and new. She said, "That's the most practical proposal I've ever heard." I said it wasn't a proposal. "What is it then?" "It's a statement of intent," I said. "The proposal comes after." She didn't smile exactly, but something in her face opened, something that had been held careful and close. She said, "All right. Then I'm accepting the statement of intent." I drank my coffee. Outside the window, the light was coming up over the bench, and the hills beyond it were turning from black to brown to their proper color, the long yellow grass lit at the tops by the early sun, the creek drawing a line of green through it. My land. Our land. Solid and particular and real in the way that only actual things are real. August, then September. I went to Flagstone and filed the joint claim, and while I was there I found the lawyer I'd used before, the slow one, and this time I wasn't asking for anything. I was telling him something. I told him about the Barrow Creek property and about the territorial court's acceptance of the railroad survey, and I asked him what legal options existed, even now. He hemmed and hawed, as he did, and ultimately he said there were options, but they were long and expensive and probably futile. I said I understood, and I found, sitting in that office, that I could accept it. Not because it had been right, it hadn't been right, it had been a kind of legal theft dressed up in paperwork, but because I was on the other side of it now, and the weight of it was different from here. It was still there. It would always be there, but it was behind me, and I was facing the other direction. I thought about Ellen on the way back. I let myself think about her for the first time in a long time without the grief turning to the kind of dark weight that stops you. I remembered her specifically, her laugh, which was louder than you expected from a small woman, the way she argued about where to put the vegetable garden, the evening she made me dance in the kitchen because there was no fiddle player for miles and she was tired of waiting for one. I remembered her, and it hurt the way it should hurt, cleanly, without bitterness. I rode back to the claim, and the light was going when I came over the last ridge, and I could see the lamp in the window from a quarter-mile away. That small yellow square. Someone in there who'd waited and not been sure when I'd get back and kept the lamp on anyway. I rode down to it. The trouble with Holt resolved itself, though not the way I'd expected. In September, a man named Terrell bought up Holt's operation. Holt had debts, it turned out, and when the beef prices dropped in late summer, his position became untenable. Terrell was a different kind of man. He'd come from cattle country to the north, and he had no particular interest in a water use dispute with a neighboring property. He came by in October to introduce himself, rode over respectfully, didn't send men. He shook my hand. He shook Clara's. He said, "I hear there was some trouble over the eastern draw." Clara said, "There was." He said, "There won't be again." That was all. He was a man of his word, as it turned out. Clara and I had supper that evening, and she said, "Things have a way of working out." I said they sometimes did. She said, "You sound surprised." I thought about it. I said, "I was a man who believed things worked out. Then I was a man who didn't. Now I'm in between, working on it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You built that fence line twice. You drove those men back without flinching. You filed the claim and you rode to Flagstone and back and you came home." She paused. "You are not a man things happen to. You are a man who handles things." I looked at her. She meant it. She wasn't saying it to make me feel something. She was saying it because it was her honest assessment, and Clara's honest assessments were worth having. I said, "A man alone handles things alone. That's not the same." "No," she said, "it's not." October. The first anniversary of the burning at Barrow Creek came and went, and I didn't mark it out loud, but I knew it, felt it in my chest when I woke up that morning, a dull recognition, like pressing on a bruise. I lay still for a while and let the feeling come through. Then I got up. There was fence work to do on the north line, and a section of roof on the new room that needed pointing before the cold set in, and Clara wanted to start banking the earth around the foundation before the first hard freeze. Work, real and specific and mine to do. I was pointing the roof mortar mid-morning when I heard her below me, working the soil around the foundation with a mattock, the steady chunk of it in the cold air. I could see her from where I was, the top of her head, her breath coming in small clouds. She stopped after a while and looked up at me. She said, "You're quiet today." I said, "It's a year." She set the mattock down. She didn't say she was sorry or that it would get better. She just looked up at me for a moment, steady and clear. Then she said, "Come down when you're ready." She picked up the mattock and went back to work. That was the right thing. Exactly the right thing. Come down when you're ready, not when you should be ready, not when you ought to be over it, but when you are. No hurry, she'd be there. I finished pointing the mortar. I came down. The proposal, when it came, wasn't much of a ceremony. It was a November evening, cold enough that we'd lit the stove in the main room early, and the fire was burning well and the room was warm, and we'd eaten and the dishes were done, and we were sitting the way we usually sat in the evenings. She with mending, me with the paperwork I'd been putting off, the accounting for the season, the planning for the next. I put the papers down. I said, "Clara." She looked up. I said, "I'd like to marry you, if you'll have me." She looked at me for a moment. Something in her face was absolutely still, and then it wasn't, it shifted, softened, became the face underneath the face she showed the world, which was something private and particular and meant for me. She said, "I've been waiting for you to get to that." I said, "I'm a slow mover." "You are," she said, "but you move sure." She set her mending down and she stood up and she came around the table and she took my face in both her hands, weathered and strong, the hands of a woman who'd worked beside me through a whole summer, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at me in the starlight back in July, direct and certain, and she said, "Yes, of course, yes." I put my hands over hers. The fire was going, the room was warm, and outside the wind was starting to come down off the ridge the way it did in November, long and cold. But inside there was the lamp and the fire and her hands on my face and the weight of a year behind us. The ash at Barrow Creek and the gray months in Hatcher and the fence line and the 3 men and the flat bench and all the mornings of coffee and work and the slow, sure knowledge of each other that you build day by day until one day it's just there, solid and settled, like ground under your feet. We were married in December in Flagstone in the county office, with the clerk as witness. It took about 8 minutes and cost $2. On the ride back, she said, "That was shorter than the fence filing." I said, "The fence filing was more complicated." She laughed. That sound, I'd been hearing it all fall and I'd started to need it, the way you need a particular sound. She laughed, and the horse's breath made clouds in the cold air, and the road home ran out ahead of us, frozen dirt and dry grass, and the hills going pale gold in the late light. There's not much left to say. That winter we planned the alfalfa rotation properly, on paper, and in the spring we broke the flat bench and planted it. By the 2nd year it was producing, and by the 3rd it was paying. We built the house right, 2 rooms first, then 3, then 4 as we needed it, stone foundation, proper floors, a porch facing south because you want the afternoon light in the winter. We ran 30 head of cattle by the 4th year, which was enough, and Clara kept the books in a way that kept us solvent through 2 bad summers when everyone around us was struggling. I will tell you one more thing. The deed from Barrow Creek. I still had it, still carried it in my coat. Clara found it one afternoon when she was airing out my winter coat in the spring, found it in the inside pocket, folded and worn at the creases, the clerk's red seal faded to a smear. She brought it in and set it on the table. I looked at it. She said, "What do you want to do with it?" I thought about it for a while. I thought about what it had meant, what I'd believed it meant, that clean proof of ownership, that formal promise that a thing was yours. And I thought about what it had turned out to mean, which was less than I'd believed. I said, "Keep it." She looked at me. "Keep it," I said. "Put it with the deed to this land, so I know the difference." She picked it up. She looked at it for a moment, at the red seal, at the description of the land at Barrow Creek, at the names and figures. Then she folded it back along its creases and went to the box where we kept the important papers, and she put it in there, where it still is, under the deed to the land on the creek, the one with Clara's name on it next to mine. Outside the window, the flat bench was green with the second year's alfalfa. The creek was running, which it did in May, fast and clear and cold. The hills beyond it were the particular green that only lasts a few weeks in spring before the summer bleaches it out, and they were that green now, and the sky above them was high and blue and enormous. Clara came back to the table. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Are you all right?" I said I was. I was.